what the House
sends.
To
vacate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Mr. President, before I start, I would ask unanimous consent that my law clerk, Jeff Gary, be granted floor privileges for the remainder of this Congress.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I believe the American people should be deeply concerned about the vote the Senate took yesterday to invoke cloture, in effect ending real debate and preventing the Senate from considering any amendments to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act reauthorization. This isn't what's called regular order. This isn't how the Senate ought to operate. In fact, it's not even how the Senate has handled surveillance bills in the past. Even in the weeks after the horrendous attacks of 9/11, the Senate considered amendments to the Patriot Act. And in 2008, when the Senate first considered Section 702, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, there were, in fact, amendments. But now debate has been cut off, and no senator, neither a Democrat or a Republican, is going to be allowed to offer an amendment. And what the country is going to be left with is a deeply flawed bill that in a number of ways is actually worse than current law. Now, I want to talk first about whose rights are at stake. We're talking primarily, at this part of my address, about Americans who talk to foreigners overseas. Law-abiding Americans whose communications can get swept up under this law. They could be, for example, American business people, perhaps somebody working for a tech company in Colorado or Oregon, or perhaps somebody working for a steel company in the Midwest. These are American business people, law-abiding people talking to a foreign contact. They could be swept up under this law. Or we could be talking about first, second, or third generation Americans talking to family and friends still overseas. Maybe they're catching up. Maybe they're talking about kids and grandkids. Maybe they're just talking about their hopes and aspirations. But they're still Americans, law-abiding Americans, who could get swept up in this bill. We could be talking about American journalists covering foreign stories. We could be talking about U.S. service members talking to foreign friends they made while deployed. Try to get your arms around that one, Mr. President. And I think it's particularly unfortunate because one of the things that I'm proudest of is I was able to ensure that Americans overseas, service members, would have their privacy rights protected. We got a law passed to do that. And I remember George W. Bush had reservations about that proposal I made to protect the privacy rights of our law-abiding service members overseas. Said originally he might veto the bill, and by the end it was in his press release saying how great it was. And I think it was because nobody had really talked about the rights of these wonderful men and women who wear the uniform of the United States. We did it right back when George W. Bush was president. We protect the privacy rights of our service members overseas. Now we're talking about walking back the rights of those U.S. service members if they're talking to foreign friends they made while deployed. And we could be talking about American teachers and researchers seeking information from foreigners. But now this body isn't going to have a chance to even consider reforms that might protect the constitutional rights of these Americans, the business person, the service member, the first, second, or third generation American, immigrant. Because what's happened is the Senate is being forced to vote on a reauthorization bill without any public discussion about any kind of alternatives. The one committee consideration, what's called a markup, occurred entirely in secret. That's public law being debated in secret. And yesterday, the Senate discussed whether to cut off debate on a bill that authorizes vast, unchecked surveillance powers in less time than it takes to shop for the week's groceries. So now, with no amendments possible, there's not going to be a single opportunity for the public to see its representatives explain why they're supporting or why they are rejecting these key reforms. You can only conclude from this that opponents of reforms just were scared. They were frightened. They just didn't want to have them debated in the open. They must be worried that the more Americans understand about the program and the more they hear about common sense, bipartisan proposals to fix it, the more the public is going to say, we can do better. We can do better than the status quo. Because the public, once they have the benefit of a little transparency and a little open debate, what I have seen, and I've just finished my 865th open to all town meeting at home in Oregon, once you talk to folks at home about these issues, they understand that security and liberty aren't mutually exclusive, that sensible policies get you both, not so sensible policies and failure to look at the issues really get less of both. My view is the Senate let down the American people yesterday. In my view, we have a solemn obligation to deliberate, to consider amendments, to vote up or down. And I think that is really what the Senate is all about. One of the worst arguments for jamming this bill through without amendments was that somehow this law was going away. It just wouldn't be around. It was expiring. First, members who wanted to debate reforms were prepared to go to this floor many months ago. Nothing stood in the way of a floor debate last year. But even today, there's no reason to rush all this through. Absolutely nothing prevents the Congress from extending 702 authorities for a week or two to allow us to carry out our constitutional responsibilities. And by the way, the Director of National Intelligence has said publicly and on the record that its authorities continue until April. So, Mr. President, I was stunned. I had senators on both sides of the aisle I like very much, good, dedicated senators, saying, oh my goodness, we've got to act. If we don't act here in the next few days, oh my goodness, powerful tools that we need to stop the terrorists, and I don't take a backseat to anybody in terms of stopping the terrorists, they're going to be gone. That's just not true. And Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent to put into the record the statement from the Office of National Intelligence where the director said on the record that its authorities would continue.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. So, despite yesterday's vote, I regret to have to say I'm going to have to oppose this legislation on final passage. My view is that if this bill does not go forward now, it's possible to get Democrats and Republicans back to work together and ensure that there's a meaningful debate on the floor of the United States Senate, and that this is done with ample time to meet this window that the Office of National Intelligence has talked about publicly. But if that doesn't happen, the Senate has denied itself the opportunity to even attempt to fix this badly flawed bill. This surveillance authority allows the government to sweep up some untold amount of law-abiding Americans' communications. The government says, of course, that its targets are terrorists, and this is about keeping Americans safe from terrorism. Mr. President, I don't take a backseat to anybody in terms of fighting terrorist threats. Having served on the Intelligence Committee for some time now, I can tell all members and the public there is no question that the terrorist threat is real and that there are significant numbers of people who represent a very real threat to the well-being of our country. Now, if somebody says we've got to keep Americans safe from terrorism, I am all in, and I would submit, Mr. President, I don't know of a single United States senator, not 1 out of 100, who is not all in on this fight against terrorism. But that is not what the law says. The law says that under Section 702, the government can collect without a warrant the communications of foreigners to acquire foreign intelligence information. And here's how the law defines foreign intelligence information. It's information that relates to the conduct of the, quote, foreign affairs of the United States. Mr. President, that is just about any piece of information about a foreign country. And who can the government target to get all this information? Anybody expected to possess, receive, and or is likely to communicate that information. So if you unpack that, you don't have to be a terrorist suspect or any kind of threat to the United States to be a target under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. The government just has to think that you know something the government wants to know. That's why so many Americans, Democrats, Republicans, and independents, are worried about getting their private communications swept up. They're law-abiding people, as I've been saying, service members, business people. Americans who on a regular basis talk to friends and families and contact overseas. They're worried because based on what the law says, which I've just read, those foreigners could be targets and the Americans' communications could be collected by the government. Now, for years, I and other members of the Congress, both houses, both parties, tried to at least get an estimate of how many law-abiding Americans' communications have been getting swept up. As recently as April of 2017, the Director of National Intelligence said that the public was going to get some kind of estimate. But in June, the Director suddenly changed course and told the public and the Congress, you're not getting anything. What that means is that no one knows the size of the databases. Nobody knows how many Americans' private communications are sitting there waiting to be searched and possibly used against those Americans. Just yesterday, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Board was invoked by those opposing reforms. But what that board had to say about the sheer volume of American communications being swept up is actually, in their words, too much expansion in the collection of U.S. persons' communications, or the uses to which these communications are put, may push the program over the line, over the constitutional line. So here they were, being cited in effect as supporters for the status quo, when I just read you, they're concerned about the status quo. This is why, Mr. President, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act today is an end run on the Constitution, and it is what the President of the Senate and other members of this body, both Democrats and Republicans, have wanted to change. And this end run is not just the vast collection. It's that after all the communications of our people are swept up, the government can go searching for individual Americans through all that data. They don't have to be suspected of anything. The government just has to decide on its own that your private communications might reveal some intelligence or some evidence of a crime. And that search, like the collection of the communications, takes place without a warrant. No warrant on the collection of Americans' communications, no warrant on searching for individual Americans. Mr. President, this is a case of two wrongs, certainly not making a right. What the Senate did last night was prevent any debate on this basic constitutional question. The USA Rights Act, introduced by 15 senators of both parties, would have required a warrant for those searches of Americans. Our colleagues, Senator Leahy and Senator Lee, have legislation requiring warrants, a Democrat and a Republican. Other members have had their own proposals. None of them are going to get heard by the Senate. If we'd had a chance to consider amendments, we could have fixed the underlying bill, which doesn't require any warrants for any searches for Americans. Let me just repeat that. The underlying bill does not require any warrants for any searches for Americans. None. Not in intelligence cases, not in criminal cases. Warrantless fishing expeditions for Americans can just go on and on and on. The bill's so-called reform only applies to the government's access to the results of the searches. But it really doesn't even do that. It only kicks in if the government is already well down the road of investigating somebody. This means the bill provides more rights to criminal suspects than to innocent Americans. Think about what that's going to mean in Texas or Oregon or North Carolina or anywhere else in the country. This bill provides more rights, as I've described it, to criminal suspects than to innocent Americans. And it gets worse, because the bill's even narrower than that. It imposes no limitations at all if the government determines that the search relates to national security or to a criminal matter that has nothing at all to do with national security. Why are opponents of reform happy now? Because their bill does nothing. I went and read the Director of National Intelligence Statistics for 2016. The CIA, the National Security Agency, conducted over 5,000 warrantless searches for Americans, according to this material. Doesn't include the FBI, whose searches are supposedly too numerous to even count. Doesn't include communications record searches, which number in the tens of thousands. How many times did the government encounter a situation in which, under this bill, there would even be the possibility of needing a warrant? Exactly one. That's right, one among the thousands and thousands of warrantless searches for Americans. And even that is an overstatement, because that one instance in 2016 could have occurred prior to a predicated investigation, in which case it too would be exempt from warrant requirements. Basically, this bill that we will vote on provides an easy-to-read roadmap to the government to make sure it never has to get a warrant for anything. Meanwhile, the thousands of Americans subject to warrantless backdoor searches each year have no protections at all. Mr. President, had there been amendments, I think there would have been the familiar argument against requiring a warrant for searches of Americans' private communications. We would have heard the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act is necessary to connect the dots between suspects and terrorists. Here's why that's misleading. Opponents of reform like to talk about a tip to the government that somebody is acting strange on a bridge. They say this is a situation when the government needs to go directly to reading the private communications of this person. That's just not how the Constitution works. And think about it. Would you want the content of your private communications searched, accessed, and read just because somebody's got a slight suspicion about you? And here's the misleading part. Opponents of reform say that unless the government searches for and reads the emails, it just can't connect the dots to the terrorists. That is just false. The government already has the authority to get this information, and in a less intrusive way. Now, some may remember just a few years ago, there was a debate about ending metadata, the bulk collection of millions of phone records on law-abiding Americans. What remained at the end of that debate was the authority of the government to go get the phone and email records of anyone as long as the records were relevant to an investigation. And if it's an emergency, the government can get those records immediately without having to go to the court first. And I want to emphasize that, Mr. President, because it's something that I have felt very strongly about, and I wrote that section, it's Section 102 of the USA Freedom Act, because I wanted to make sure that it was clear in this debate about finding policies where security and liberty aren't mutually exclusive, where we have both. I wanted to make sure that the strongest possible message was sent, that if the government believes that there's an emergency, the government can move immediately to get the information it needs and then come back later and settle up with the warrant process. Mr. President, when I have the opportunity to be in the Oval Office, which I've had several times, it's a wonderful honor, a privilege given by the people of Oregon to pursue these issues. I will say what I say to a president, not what the president says back, because I think those are private communications of the president. But at one point in this debate, I said to President Obama, if you and your staff feels that the current emergency provisions are not adequate, if you think they're not strong enough, I want to know about it, because I will work with you to make sure that they do the job. And that's because when there's an emergency, Mr. President, and the security and the well-being of the American people's on the line, the government gets the chance to move quickly, come back, and settle later on the warrant process. And I've included that in essentially all the legislation that I've authored. This provision of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act is what allows the government to connect the dots without going directly to the content of private communications. That's how our system is supposed to work. The government gets less intrusive information on Americans using a lower standard first. So what if the government needs the content of communications urgently? What if the government sees an immediate threat and believes it has no choice but to read those communications right away? As I said, that's why we had the amendment that I described in the USA Freedom Act, and it's why we said in our amendment to Section 702, this proposal, that we would also have an emergency exception. So again, USA Freedom Act, emergency exception, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, emergency exception. In this case, under our proposal, an emergency, the government can search for and read those communications immediately and seek a warrant later. Our proposal also includes other exceptions to the warrant requirement, such as a hostage situation where a search might help save someone. So I bring this up only by way of saying, Mr. President, reformers have been very clear. When the government has an emergency that is defined by the government, not by somebody else who might conceivably not have all the information, what we did in the USA Freedom Act is what we are doing in the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which is protecting the American people in an emergency. Now, there are other facts about warrantless backdoor searches that opponents of a warrant requirement omit from public arguments. For years after the original passage of the law, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, the CIA and the National Security Agency didn't have the authority to conduct the searches. What's more, the Bush administration never asked the FISA court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act court, for the authorities. The Bush administration didn't think it was a problem that the CIA and the NSA could conduct warrantless backdoor searches of Americans. But now people act like the warrantless searches are somehow inseparable from the broader program. They pretend that you really can't have an effective foreign intelligence collection program unless you just make sure you're violating the rights of Americans. This week should have been an opportunity to discuss the facts of how this bill could have been improved. Should have been an opportunity to clarify that Americans don't have to choose between security and liberty. This should have been the Senate's chance to push back against scare tactics and fear-mongering and lay out for the public what the government does and doesn't need to protect us. Instead, we get a bill that isn't necessary for our security and does nothing to protect our liberty. There are other important amendments that are not going to be considered. One relates to what is known as abouts collection, a process in which two innocent Americans could have their communications swept up if they just write an email referencing a foreign target. We're talking about communications entirely among individuals who are themselves not targets and are potentially all Americans. The whole concept is just contrary to the Fourth Amendment. As the Privacy Board concluded, there was nothing comparable in the law. I'll quote, from a legal standpoint, under the Fourth Amendment, the government may not, without a warrant, open and read letters sent through the mail in order to acquire those that contain particular information. Likewise, the government can't listen to phone conversations without probable cause about one of the callers or about the phone in order to keep recordings of those conversations that contain particular content. That's the quote from the Privacy Board. And you sure heard on the floor the sponsors of the status quo, in my view, suggest that the Privacy Board had a different view of what they were up to. From a practical standpoint, this form of collection was so problematic that the government itself was forced to shut it down. Now the underlying bill says go ahead and start it up as long as you tell Congress. Congress got to be told anyway. Based on the bill before us, if Congress does what it does best, which is nothing, the government can just go ahead. Again, I don't think that's what the public thinks the Senate should be about. If the government ever wants to get back in the business of this abouts collection, it can come to the Congress and get it authorized. If their argument wins the day, so be it. But by preemptively writing into black letter law this form of collection, sight unseen, means that this Senate is surrendering our constitutional responsibilities. This is one of the examples, this abouts collection that I've mentioned, Mr. President, of why this bill actually is a retreat from current law. Congress has never approved abouts collection. Wasn't in the 2008 bill creating the law or the first reauthorization of Section 702. It happened because of a secret interpretation of the law, and most of Congress knew nothing about it. But now, for the first time, when the government itself has suspended it, largely because they know it had been abused, what we're doing is essentially setting up what amounts to a fast-track process to write it back into the law. It defines abouts collection broadly, broader even than the government, and it invites its resumption. Now, the Senate's also not going to get to consider an amendment limiting how information on Americans can be used against Americans. The bill allows unlimited secret use of Section 702 information, all collected without a warrant, in any investigation or in any administrative or civil procedures against Americans. Now, Americans understand how the government can thoroughly disrupt their lives without ever charging them with a crime, particularly if they're doing it based on secret information. But when it comes to using 702 information as evidence in criminal proceedings against Americans, the bill provides no real protections. All the government needs is for the Attorney General to determine that the criminal proceedings relate to national security or involve a set of crimes that have nothing at all to do with national security. It's a catch-all category called transnational crime. Now, I have tried for some time to get the government to tell me what this transnational crime is. Haven't gotten much of a response. In any case, the underlying bill here specifically says that the Attorney General's decisions cannot be challenged in court. So there you are. If the Attorney General decides that the crime you are being charged with somehow relates to national security or is a, quote, transnational crime, that decision by the Attorney General is just really pretty much sacred. You can go to jail without ever being allowed to challenge the government's use of Section 702 information against you, information that was obtained without a warrant and potentially uncovered as a result of warrantless searches specifically conducted to find your communications and communications about you. The ways in which the government could potentially use this information collected without a warrant to investigate and prosecute Americans and those in the United States are limitless. Immigration status, recreational drugs, drug taxes, the list goes on and on. I don't think Americans think that's how the system is supposed to work. Is that what a warrantless foreign intelligence surveillance bill is supposed to do? I don't think so. Immigration status, recreational drugs, back taxes. That's what this bill allows. And the bill leaves in place other problems that affect our rights. One of them is the issue of what's called parallel construction. That's a lot of fancy legalese that even if information against an American originally comes from Section 702, if the government subsequently constructs a case from other collection, it never has to tell that American it used Section 702. My bill with Senator Paul and 13 other senators would have fixed that. The bill we're voting on shortly, without any debate, nothing on amendments, also leaves in place a big catch-22 that prevents anybody from ever challenging Section 702 in court. Section 702 collection is secret, so almost no one can prove definitively that they personally were swept up. That means it's also almost impossible to get standing to go to court and challenge Section 702. I'm sure it pleases opponents of reform, but it means that Section 702 isn't going to be part of any court review process where both sides to the adversarial system get heard. Fixing this problem is not, as some in the House misleadingly said, giving rights to terrorists. That was part of the fear-mongering that went on. What this is simply saying that Section 702 is not exempt from constitutional challenges that apply to every single federal statute, and by the way, are the hallmark of our constitutional system. There are other problems which could have been fixed with amendments. I'm particularly troubled by the fact that the underlying bill doesn't fix the problem of reverse targeting. This is where the government targets a foreigner overseas when it's really interested in collecting the communications of an American without a warrant. Right now, the law as written allows this collection to continue without a warrant unless, in effect, the only purpose of the collection is to obtain the American's communications. My concern is that if the government has even the slightest interest in the foreign target, it's not going to seek a warrant regardless of the intensity of the government's interest in the American on the other end of the phone or the email. This could mean, again, frequent, ongoing searches of the American's communications. It could mean the use of the American's communications in investigations and criminal proceedings. There's a solution to this. We proposed it, and that is if a significant purpose for targeting a foreigner is to get an American's communications, the government would need a warrant. Pretty simple, Mr. President. And I note the President of the Senate was supportive of reforms and our bipartisan coalition. I very much appreciate that. Just think about that. We had a solution to the fact that reverse targeting has been abused. And we simply said if a significant purpose of the government for targeting a foreigner is to get an American's communications, the government would need a warrant. And of course, we have the emergency exception in the bill as well. The bill also doesn't prevent the government from directing service providers to modify or weaken encryption without any court oversight. And I'm telling you, this problem has been underappreciated. As we all know, there is an ongoing debate about whether the government should be able to mandate backdoor weaknesses in encryption. I believe that this kind of authority is just a loser all around. I think Americans, if you weaken strong encryption, will be less safe. Certainly, parents who are concerned about a youngster don't want to weaken the protection in their smartphone for the tracker so they can keep tabs on their kids. And I'm telling you, if the government is allowed to mandate backdoor weaknesses in our products, I believe we'll be less safe, we will have less liberty, and it'll be a big loser for many of our high-skill, high-wage companies. And I've already announced, Mr. President, if there is any effort to weaken strong encryption, I will do everything in my power to block that legislation, because it is a loser from a security standpoint, it is a loser from a liberty standpoint, and it will be bad news for a lot of our companies that pay good wages for the high skills of Americans. Even those who argue that the government should be able to mandate backdoor weaknesses in encryption assure us that it's only going to happen if the court orders it. But under Section 702, the government could direct a service provider to do that without any court awareness at all. And of course, the Congress might not know either. Now, again, we would have liked to fix this here on the floor. The legislation I have, the bipartisan legislation with Senator Paul, requires that the FISA court approve of the kind of technical assistance the government is seeking from providers, which would also result in the Congress finding out. This bill that we'll be voting on soon doesn't do that, and as a result, the court and the Congress could end up totally in the dark about an issue that I think is absolutely central to the security and well-being of our people in the 21st century. The bill also provides no clarification on the question of whether Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act can be used to collect communications the government knows are entirely domestic. Put your arms around that. This law is called the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and we can't even get a straight answer from the government, from the Director of National Intelligence, about whether the law can be used to collect communications the government knows are entirely domestic. When I first asked the head of National Intelligence whether 702 provided this authority, he said in a public hearing, no, that would be against the law. But then, apparently, he told folks in the news media that he was answering a different question than the one I asked. So I asked once again the Director of National Intelligence to answer the question I had asked, at which point he then wrote and said the whole thing was classified. This is the essence of what is secret law. I believe it's the kind of thing that erodes trust in the government and in the intelligence community specifically. So had we been able to have a real debate, I would have offered an amendment that would, in effect, write into black letter law what the head of national intelligence told me at first when I asked him, could FISA be used to collect wholly domestic communications? Before all this George Orwell stuff, the head of national intelligence said no, FISA could not be used to collect wholly personal communications. That answer would have reassured the American people. But after all of this back and forth and the bizarre situation where the Director of National Intelligence says the whole thing is classified after he's already given an answer in public, now the public isn't going to have an opportunity to see its representatives address this issue or take a position. Supporters of the bill point to provisions related to oversight of Section 702. Here's how inadequate those are. Yesterday we heard again about the Privacy Board. Right now the Privacy Board is restricted to reviewing counter-terror programs. Most intelligence programs aren't neatly categorized that way. They're broader than that. And of course, the effect on Americans' privacy has nothing to do with whether a collection program is about terrorism or anything else. This bill leaves in place completely arbitrary limits on the Privacy Board and their ability to oversee the country's intelligence programs. Finally, the bill does not meaningfully strengthen the FISA court in a way that I think is very basic. There are people with top security clearances who appear before the court and provide the only alternative view in what is otherwise basically the government's show. The FISA court's often gone years without addressing serious legal and constitutional questions. But sometimes the court never gets to them. Right now, these sort of friends of the court are only heard from when the court invites them. But imagine if these folks who have top security clearance were informed about what was going on and could raise issues with the court when they felt it was important. It's not going to hinder the FISA, court, but it would greatly improve the chance the court would consider serious issues earlier. Once again, no reform. There are also basic principles of transparency that are ignored in the bill. Right now, the CIA and the NSA are obligated to inform the public how many searches of Americans they conduct. The FBI is not. I don't see a good argument why Congress shouldn't change that. The American people desire to know how often the CIA and the NSA conduct warrantless searches looking for information on them, they deserve to know how often the FBI does so, particularly because the FBI conducts searches for evidence of a crime as well as for intelligence. So I believe I've outlined the faults of the bill. This is not reform, Mr. President. It is not even business as usual. It is a retreat. It is, in fact, worse than just extending the program's business as usual, because for the first time, it writes into black letter law problematic practices as I've outlined. There's not real oversight. There's not transparency. That's what the public demands. That's what I heard people asking for at the town hall meetings I held last weekend in Oregon. And there are a lot of unanswered questions Americans still have about the program. Mr. President, there's certainly many members of Congress who share my concerns, who've devoted much of their career to ensuring that Americans have security and liberty. I want to especially express my appreciation to Senators Paul and Lee. They've been tireless champions. Senator Leahy has led on this critical matter for decades. Chairman Leahy on the Intelligence Committee. Senator Heinrich, my seatmate, is, I think, one of this body's real rising stars because it's willing to dig deeply into the issues. And in the House, 183 members voted for the most comprehensive Section 702 reform bill, the House version of the USA Rights Act. And as we saw last night, Mr. President, and the President of the Senate and I were involved in a lot of those deliberations down here in the well of the Senate, this was a really close vote. You know, a lot of people say, well, you know, the reformers, they're going to say their piece and they're going to get 6, 8, 10 votes and the like. Well, I think last night we really brought home what I hear Americans say, Democrats, Republicans, by the way, many independents who really have questions about the way the government works and want to see their liberties protected in a way that also keeps them safe. And a big group of members in the other body, and last night, a big group of United States senators said, what a quaint idea. Let's have the United States Senate be the United States Senate. Let's have a few amendments. It was communicated to the leaders. I want to thank Senator Schumer for making it clear that he thought that some amendments would make this a better, fuller, and more complete debate. And I just think it's very unfortunate with the fact that there are so many important issues here. It's an important bill. And I hope people have seen that, having spent a lot of time on these issues over the years, I think we really need to have more time spent on this floor getting a chance to debate these issues, have senators of both parties working in good faith, working towards constructive solutions. I think support for what we sought last night, which is a real debate and real solutions and actual amendments, I think more and more Americans are coming around to seeing that's the way to proceed, because Americans aren't going to buy the idea, well, we'll just say you've got to give up some of your liberty to have security. Ben Franklin said it really well. So anybody who gives up their liberty to have security really doesn't deserve either. What we need are smart policies. That's why I talked about encryption. Strong encryption makes us safer. It also protects our liberty. And that's why I outlined some of the deep flaws in this bill. I'm telling you, I think this bill puts on fast track going back to a ballots collection where somebody's barely mentioned, and all of a sudden the government is collecting information on them. So, Mr. President, I will oppose final passage of this legislation. Nothing is preventing the Congress from getting this right. As I mentioned, the Office of National Intelligence, the director of the relevant agencies, has said there's plenty of time for us to take this bill, have a few amendments, a real debate, and come up with a bill that better ensures that Americans are both safe and free. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor. And I would note, Mr. President, the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.